e4, King's Pawn Opening, opening line. The King's Pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the Queen and the Bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c5, Sicilian Defense, opening line. The Sicilian defense has an ancient lineage. It creates an unbalanced position in which both sides have full rein for play, and allows Black to call the shots at least to some extent. Knight f3, Sicilian Defense, King's Knight variation, opening line. White's normal response prepares d4 and avoids such committing moves as f4 or d3 or Knight c3, which have their own rationale. Knight c6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Black can tip his hand with 2 d6 or e6, but the knight move is useful in virtually all Sicilians. d4, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. C takes d4, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Knight takes d4, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Knight f6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Knight c3, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. e5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Similar to the Löwenthal is the Pelican variation, but here Black has played Knight f6, and the idea is not to provoke Knight d6 check, but to compromise White's knights. Knight d b5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. d6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Bishop g5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. a6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. Knight a3, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, opening line. b5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Chelyabinsk variation, opening line. Bishop takes f6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Chelyabinsk variation, opening line. G takes f6, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Chelyabinsk variation, opening line. This is better than losing time with 9, Queen takes f6, 10, Knight d5. Knight d5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Chelyabinsk variation, opening line. f5, Sicilian Defense, Knight c6 variation, Chelyabinsk variation, Sveshnikov variation, opening line. c3. Out of opening book. Bishop d3 would have been in the Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, pelican variation, Chelyabinsk variation, Sveshnikov variation, opening line. Bishop g7 clears the way for a kingside castle. Bishop d3 protects white's pawn at e4 and enables the short castle. Bishop e6. Queen h5 pins black's pawn at f7 and makes way for a castle to the queen side. Castle kingside frees black's pawn at f7 from the pin. E takes f5, attacks black's bishop at e6. Bishop takes d5, pins white's pawn at g2 and attacks white's pawn at g2. Black wins a knight for a pawn. f6 threatens checkmate. Queen takes pawn at h7. Pins black's pawn at e5 and attacks black's bishop at g7. e4 attacks white's bishop. F takes g7. Attacks black's rook at f8, adds a promote threat at g7, and creates a passed pawn on g7. White wins a bishop. White is up a pawn. Rook e8 moves it to safety and removes the promote threat at g7. Bishop e2 moves it to safety. Knight e5 protects black's bishop. Castle kingside. Queen f6. Knight c2. Slightly better is rook f d1. The chessmaster recommends rook at f1 to d1. You move your rook at f1 to d1, which attacks black's bishop. Black counters with the bishop to b7, which moves it to safety. You move your pawn to c4. Black counters with pawn, captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on d6. Your knight captures pawn, which moves it off the edge. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn for a pawn. In addition, the mobility of your pieces is greatly enhanced, and black's attack potential is decreased. Also, black's pawn structure is somewhat weakened. Diagnosing. The chessmaster recommends rook at f1 to d1. You move your rook at f1 to d1, which attacks black's bishop. Black counters with the bishop to c6, which moves it to safety. You move your knight to c2, which takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Black answers with king, captures pawn. You move your pawn to a4. Black counters by moving the king to h8. You move your knight to b4, which blocks black's pawn at b5. Black responds with pawn to e3. Your pawn at f2 takes pawn, which isolates black's pawn at f7 and black's pawn at d6. Black responds with bishop to d7. Your pawn takes pawn, which isolates black's pawn at a6. Black counters with pawn, captures pawn. Your rook takes rook, which partially pins black's rook at e8. Black responds with rook takes rook. As a result of this line of play, you win a rook and 2 pawns for a rook and 2 pawns. Additionally, your mobility is enhanced, and black's mobility is somewhat decreased. Also, black's pawn structure is destroyed. Knight c2. Slightly better is rook f d1. Knight f3. Check. Checks white's king and blocks white's pawn at f2. Bishop takes f3. Removes the threat on white's king and attacks black's bishop. White wins a knight. White is up a knight and a pawn. Rook e5. Removes the threat on black's bishop and threatens white's queen. Queen h3. Moves it to safety. E takes f3. Knight e3. F takes g2. Threatens white's rook at f1, adds a promote threat at g2, and creates a passed pawn on g2. Black wins a bishop and a pawn. Material is even. Rook f d1. Moves it to safety and removes the promote threat at g2. Bishop e6. Threatens white's queen. Queen g3. Moves it to safety and protects white's pawn at g7. h5. Rook d4. King h7. Slightly better is rook g5. Thinking. The chess master recommends rook to g5. You move your rook to g5, which forks white's pawn at g7 and white's queen and places it behind the passed pawn at g2. White answers with queen, captures pawn at d6, which pins your bishop. You move your queen to f3, which frees your bishop from the pin and blocks white's pawn at f2. White counters by moving the rook to e1. Your rook takes pawn, which isolates white's pawn at f2 and white's pawn at h2. White responds with the queen to e5. You move your rook to c8. White responds by moving the rook to d6, which attacks your pawn at a6. You move your rook to a8, which removes the threat on your pawn at a6. White replies by moving pawn to b4. Your bishop takes pawn. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. In addition, white's pawn structure is destroyed. Also, the pressure on white's king is somewhat increased. King h7. Slightly better is rook g5. Rook a d1. Slightly better is f4. Analyzing. The chess master recommends pawn to f4. You move your pawn to f4, which attacks black's rook at e5. Black replies by moving the rook to c5, which moves it to safety. Your rook takes pawn, which pins black's bishop. Black replies by moving the rook to g8, which blocks your pawn at g7, removes the promote threat at g7, and moves it behind the passed pawn at g2. You move your queen to f2. Black counters with rook at g8, takes pawn, which protects black's pawn at g2, and isolates your pawn at f4 and your pawn at h2. You move your rook at a1 to d1. Black counters by moving the queen to e7, which frees black's bishop from the pin. Your knight takes pawn, which attacks black's rook at c5 and isolates black's pawn at f7 and black's pawn at h5. Black replies by moving the bishop to g4, which threatens your rook at d1. You move your rook at d1 to d2, which moves it to safety. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. Additionally, your attack potential is greatly enhanced. Also, black's pawn formation is demolished. Rook a d1. Slightly better is f4. Rook g8. Blocks white's pawn at g7, removes the promote threat at g7, and moves it behind the passed pawn at g2. f4. Attacks black's rook at e5. Rook c5. Moves it to safety. f5. Attacks black's bishop. Bishop takes f5, removes the threat on black's pawn at d6, and creates a passed pawn on f7. Black wins a pawn. Knight d5. Attacks black's queen and blocks black's pawn at d6. Queen h6. Slightly better is queen e5. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends queen to e5. You move your queen to e5, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy and seizes the open file. White answers with pawn to b4, which threatens your rook at c5. Your rook at g8 takes pawn, which attacks white's queen and isolates white's pawn at h2. White counters with queen to f3, which moves it to safety and attacks your pawn at h5. You move your bishop to c2, which removes the threat on your pawn at h5 and attacks white's rook at d1. White counters with pawn captures rook. Your pawn captures pawn, which attacks white's rook at d4. White responds with the knight to f6, which removes the threat on white's rook at d4 and white's rook at d1, checks your king, and blocks your pawn at f7. You move your king to h6, which moves it out of check and forks white's rook at d4 and white's rook at d1. White counters with knight to d7, which attacks your queen. Your bishop captures rook, which attacks white's queen. White counters with rook captures bishop, which removes the threat on white's queen. You move your queen to e7, which moves it to safety. As a result of this line of play, white's attack potential is decreased. Additionally, your pawn structure is somewhat stronger, and white's pawn formation is demolished. Also, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. Queen h6. Slightly better is Queen e5. Queen f2. Threatens black's bishop. Rook takes d5. Partially pins white's rook at d4 and removes the threat on black's bishop. Rook takes d5. Attacks black's bishop with 2 pieces and blocks black's pawn at d6. Bishop e6. Moves it to safety and attacks white's rook at d5. Rook takes d6. Pins black's bishop and attacks black's pawn at a6. Rook takes g7. Protects black's pawn at g2 and isolates white's pawn at h2. Rook takes a6. Protects white's pawn at a2 and isolates black's pawn at b5. White wins a rook and 2 pawns for a knight and a pawn. Rook g6. Frees black's bishop from the pin. Queen d2. Queen g7. Rook d6. Rook g5. Queen d3. Check. Protects white's pawn at a2 and checks black's king. Bishop f5. Slightly better is Rook f5. Evaluating. The chess master recommends Rook to f5. You move your rook to f5, which removes the threat on your king and attacks white's pawn at a2. White answers with pawn to b3, which protects white's pawn at a2. You move your queen to g6, which frees the pin on your rook. White responds by moving the rook to d8. You move your king to g7. White replies by moving queen to d4, which checks your king. You move your rook to f6, which removes the threat on your king. White responds by moving queen to d6. You move your queen to g4. White responds by moving the queen to d2. You move your rook to g6, which moves it behind the passed pawn at g2. As a result of this sequence of moves, white's pawn structure is slightly weaker. Bishop f5. Slightly better is Rook f5. Queen d4. Moves it out of immediate danger. Queen g8. Queen f4. Bishop e6. Attacks white's pawn at a2. Queen e4. Check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and checks black's king. Rook g6. Leads to rook takes e6, f takes e6, rook d7, check, queen g7, rook takes g7, check, king takes g7, queen e5, check, king f7, queen takes b5, king f6, queen takes h5, e5, a4, e4, queen c5, rook g7, which wins 2 rooks. For a queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns. Much better is Queen g6, leading to Queen takes g6, check. Rook takes g6. Rook 1, d2. Bishop takes a2. Rook takes g6. King takes g6. King takes g2. Bishop e6. King f3. King f5. King e3, which wins a queen, a rook, and a pawn. For a queen, a rook, and a pawn. Rook 1, d2, leads to Queen b8, a3, Queen c7, Queen e5, Bishop g4, Queen d4, Rook takes d6, Queen takes d6, Queen takes d6, Rook takes d6, Bishop f3, Rook b6, f5, Rook takes b5, which wins a queen, a rook, and a pawn. For a queen and a rook. Much better is Rook takes e6, leading to F takes e6, Rook d7, check. Queen g7, Rook takes g7, check. King takes g7, Queen e5, check. King f7, Queen takes b5, King f6, Queen takes h5, e5, a4, e4, Queen c5, Rook g7, which wins a queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns. For 2 rooks. White's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but Black ended up resigning anyway. King h6. Slightly better is Queen b8. Diagnosing. The chessmaster recommends Queen to b8. You move your queen to b8. White responds by moving the pawn to a3, which moves it to safety. You move your queen to a7, which checks White's king. White responds by moving rook at d6 to d4, which protects White's king. You move your pawn to b4. White responds with pawn at c3, takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on b4, a3, and b2. You move your queen to c7, which seizes the open file. White counters by moving the rook to d1. You move your bishop to b3, which threatens White's rook at d1 and blocks White's pawn at b2. White counters with the rook to e1, which moves it to safety. You move your king to g7, which frees your rook from the pin. White answers with queen to e8. As a result of this line of play, your mobility is somewhat increased, and White's attack potential is somewhat decreased. In addition, the development of your pawns is somewhat improved. King h6. Slightly better is Queen b8. Rook takes g2. Partially pins Black's rook and isolates Black's pawn at f7 and Black's pawn at h5. Rook takes g2, check. Forks White's king and White's pawn at b2. Queen takes g2. Removes the threat on White's pawn at b2 and White's king and threatens Black's queen. White wins a rook and a pawn for a rook. Queen c8. Moves it to safety. Queen d2, check. Checks Black's king. King h7. Moves it out of check and threatens White's pawn at a2. Queen d3 check. Protects White's pawn at a2 and forks Black's king and Black's pawn at b5. King h6. Moves it out of check. Queen e3 check. Slightly better is Queen takes b5. Evaluating. The chess master recommends Queen captures pawn. Your queen takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on c3, a2, and b2. Black replies by moving the queen to g8, which checks your king. You move your king to f2, which moves it out of check. Black replies by moving the queen to g4. You move your queen to e5. Black responds with queen to h4, which checks your king. You move your king to e2, which moves it out of check. Black responds with king to h7, which frees the pin on Black's bishop and threatens your pawn at a2. You move your pawn to b3, which removes the threat on your pawn at a2 and advances the passed pawn. Black counters with queen to g4, which checks your king and takes control of the open file. You move your king to d2, which moves it out of check. Black responds with the queen to g2, which checks your king. You move your king to c1, which moves it out of check and threatens Black's pawn at h5. Black responds with queen takes pawn at a2, which threatens your pawn at b3 with a double attack. Your queen captures pawn, which removes the threat on your pawn at b3, checks Black's king, and creates a passed pawn on h2. Black responds with king to g7, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at b3 with 2 pieces. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. In addition, your pawn structure is a little stronger. Also, the pressure on Black's king is increased. Queen e3 check. Slightly better is Queen takes b5. King h7. Moves it out of check and threatens White's pawn at a2. Queen g5. Forks Black's pawn at h5 and Black's pawn at b5. Queen c4. Ouch! Leads to Queen takes h5, check. King g7, Rook d4, Queen takes d4, check. C takes d4, Bishop takes a2, Queen takes b5, Bishop e6, Queen g5, check. King f8, d5, Bishop d7, Queen d8, check. Bishop e8, Queen f6, which wins a rook and a pawn for a queen and 2 pawns. Much better is Queen g8 leading to Queen takes g8, check. King takes g8, Rook b6, Bishop d7, Rook b7, Bishop e8, King f2, King g7, Rook c7, King f6, King e3, King e6, King e4, which wins a queen for a queen. This was Black's key blunder. Black was never able to recover and eventually resigned. Queen takes h5, check. removes the threat on white's pawn at a2, checks black's king, and creates a passed pawn on h2. White wins a pawn. King g7. Moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a2. Queen g5, check. Ouch! Leads to king h7, rook d4, which results in no captures. Much better is rook d4, leading to queen takes d4, check. C takes d4, bishop takes a2, d5, king f6, queen h4, check. King e5, queen e7, check. King f5, queen takes f7, check. King g5, queen e8, bishop c4, d6, which wins a queen and a pawn for a rook and a pawn. King h7. Moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a2. Rook d4. Attacks black's queen. Black resigns.